Is it just an audio recording?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. You don't have to worry about hair and makeup or anything like that.
I'm not looking the best.
Nomad, Christian community, mission and the future of the church.
Welcome back to Nomad Podcast. My name's Tim Nash.
And I'm Dave Ward.
Hi, Dave Ward.
Hi, Tim Nash.
How are you today?
I'm good.
What have you been up to?
Shoeing horses.
You smell of horses.
Yeah, I'm afraid so, yeah.
It's not a great smell, I'm going to be honest with you. You may have noticed I opened the window fractionally.
I hadn't noticed, actually. But, I like the smell, which is a good job in it, really.
Do you really like the smell?
I do, yeah.
It's something you get used to, like Guinness or olives.
I've always liked it.
Really?
Yeah.
That's odd.
Yeah.
It just smells of poo.
I think it is one of those love it or hate it smells. And particularly the smoke burning when you burn the shoes on to the feet is definitely a love it or hate it smell. Bit like Marmite.
Yeah. So that's been your day?
It has, yeah. And I didn't get rained upon.
Bonus?
Yeah, it's often the way, I often find that the rain stops when I get out of the van and it starts again when I get back in.
Yeah.
God's looking after me.
Yeah. God meeting your need.
Yeah.
It's almost as if it's all about you.
Yeah, no, it is. I think the whole universe revolves around me, actually.
I think Pete Rollins might have something to say about that. Glad you've had a productive day.
Yeah.
I'm a pioneer, so I've just been...
What have you been doing?
Just dossing around. Yeah. Been setting up this, Waldo. Interviews like this don't grow on trees.
No, I know.
Do you know what I mean? A lot of hard work.
Yeah, and isn't this the third attempt as well?
This is the third attempt. Although it's usually a third attempt because I have to rearrange it because you've got your diary mixed up. Whereas this time it's Pete Rollins. He had a bit of a cough, unfortunately.
Yeah, and then it was...
Then we had a dodgy internet connection.
Yeah.
So this is the third attempt. But I suspect it's going to be worth the wait.
Yeah.
Because he's always got a lot of interesting things to say. Whether you agree or not, he will stir up conversation.
And that's great, isn't it? That's what we want. People to stir up conversation.
I think so, yeah.
It's like taking risks and let's get us thinking about this stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I think you've got to, anything you believe, you've got to open it up to critique, haven't you?
Yeah.
You've got to be prepared to say, I may not have 100% truth here.
Yeah.
So, let's discuss it. And I want to hear some different perspectives. And we're all about that on Nomad Podcast.
Yeah. In fact, isn't it Dawkins who said something about that, about Christians, that one thing that he hates about Christians is that they seem to have all the answers, and he doesn't like that. He likes to have people who like to think about what they believe.
Yeah. The irony of that, of course, is that I'm pretty sure he thinks he has all the answers. So
yeah, that
doesn't really...
Yeah. He's hypocritical in that case.
I wouldn't have said that. Live on air, I don't know, you might want to have a word with your lawyer, but...
He's searched down now by Dawkins' followers.
Yeah. But we all do that, don't we?
We do.
We've got it right.
Yeah.
Great, so we're going to... Pete Rollins is in... He lives in America, but he's in
Belfast at the moment.
So we're going to Skype him in Belfast. It would have been nice to meet up with him face-to-face, but alas, the budget wouldn't stretch that far, so... Hopefully we get a good Skype connection and have a chat with him. Yeah,
it's always a bit of a worry, isn't it, with Skype?
I'm more nervous before Skype interviews than face-to-face stuff.
Yeah.
I think part of it is the technology.
Yeah, definitely.
Concerns me. Don't like relying on technology.
Yeah.
Right, so we're going to give him a bell and we'll be back with you. Oh, yeah, we sort of say we'll be back with you in a minute, but you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's instant, isn't it, for our listeners? There's no gap. We don't need to say anything, do we?
Let's just do it.
So, Pete, welcome to Nomad Podcast.
It's great to be here, thanks.
And maybe just like to start by introducing yourself to our audience.
Yeah, so my name's Pete. I'm originally from Belfast in Northern Ireland, but I'm living in America at the moment. I did my kind of education in scholastic philosophy and continental philosophy with a little bit of theology. And I'm a writer now. I speak, and I also try to help set up communities that explore issues of faith and life.
When you were a teenager, you had quite a radical conversion into the evangelical charismatic movement, and now you're known for encouraging Christians to explore themes of doubt and separation in faith. What led you to that place?
Yeah, well, some people see that as kind of like a moving away from that experience. And for a lot of my friends who had the charismatic experience, they did walk away from that, and they walked away from what they would call Christianity. But for me, I actually saw it as a deepening. I've kind of never seen myself as walking away from that experience I had when I was 17. I've kind of felt that I just keep coming back to it and try to understand it in a deeper way and remain faithful to it. And so, for example, when I entered into the charismatic church, I was a church planter there actually. There was this sense of the mystery of life and the mystery of God. There was even, I think, speaking in tongues, which was where you actually spoke a language that you didn't even understand, that transcended your intellectual abilities. And so in that place, I learned an appreciation of mystery and unknowing. However, in my own life, there was an arrogance as well. There was a sense of I had the right experience, that even though I couldn't quite name God, I still kind of felt that I was right and everybody else was wrong. And whenever I encountered someone who was different to me, I would often try to make them see the world like I saw it. But thankfully, I met some very mature, beautiful people who worked with me, who helped me see that life was bigger than I could imagine, and that doubt and brokenness and suffering were not against faith, but actually could be seen as very much a part of the life of faith. And so I kind of entered into those themes.
So looking back on that original experience that you had, how do you see that now, that conversion experience?
Yeah, well, there were three things that marked it. And by the way, it's nice to talk about it because it's one of the things I don't talk about very much. But I am actually writing a book at the moment that is going to touch upon it. So that's not going to come out for a couple of years. But, I talk theory a lot, but this all comes from practice. This all comes from an experience of my life. And three things happened. I remember when I was 17. I went home to my family and I told them I'm not part of this family anymore, which was a shock to my parents. I threw away my stuff and I stopped going to where I was doing computer studies. Now, in a sense, on that day, I had not experienced anything. There wasn't some experience that I had, but the way that I experienced everything was changed. I no longer looked at anything in the same way. So it wasn't like something else entered my world. I had 20 things and now I had 21 things, God being one of those things. It was like the way I looked at all of the things that I already had were different. And really what I think I was trying to express was when I said to my parents I wasn't part of the family, I was saying that, all of the values, good as they were, that I was brought up with, just didn't have operative power in my life anymore. When I threw away all my stuff, that was all aspirational. The cars I wanted to drive, posters of people I'd like to meet, and they didn't mean anything to me anymore. And going to tech and getting a job in computer studies just didn't mean anything. And so what I experienced, and this is very precise if someone wants to understand my work, was I didn't actually experience the addition of something onto my life. I experienced the subtraction of something. Like I was no longer part of the world. I was still in it, but I wasn't of it. I felt a rebirth. And the thing about rebirth is you don't experience birth. Birth is what opens you up to experience. Hence, a rebirth is not an experience, but it opens you up to a new mode of experience. And so what happened was I felt this profound freedom. And I saw people not as objects anymore, but briefly I saw them as beautiful, singular individuals. But the problem was I then filled my brain up with new doctrines, new theologies and new ideas, and that brief experience of subtraction was lost. And that's what I want to return to. With groups like Ikon, which is my own community, we try to experience that subtraction.
Okay, so what does being a follower of Jesus mean to you now?
Yeah, no, that's such a huge question that we could talk all day about it, but it's central. If you call yourself a Christian, you're saying something about Christ is central to you. So if you call yourself a Marxist, or if you say you're a Heideggerian or whatever it is, what you're making a claim that this way of seeing the world has some deep insight, that it's subjectively connected to you, that in a sense it's part of you. And so when I call myself a Christian, then I'm making a claim about these books called the New Testament. And the claim that I'm making is, by the way, I'm less interested in the teachings of Jesus. That's very key. And I kind of follow Paul on this, because Paul was he was the first guy to write about Christianity. Way before the Gospels, Paul was writing about Christ and Christianity. And of course, one of the interesting things is he doesn't really talk about what Jesus said or did. He doesn't talk much about the miracles. He doesn't talk much about the sayings. In fact, if you came up to Paul and you said, I listened to every word Jesus spoke and I saw every miracle, Paul would probably not be that impressed, right? Because he'd say, well, I don't care if you turn the other cheek. People do that. I don't care if you saw, feeding of 5,000 people. I want to know whether you have experienced death and resurrection, whether you've participated in this death and resurrection. So for Paul, that was central. And so if you could quote Jesus ad infinitum, it just wouldn't have impressed him that much. And so that's why I'm a bit of a conservative in some respects. I like that Pauline thing. And what I think that means, death and resurrection, which I explore in my latest book, is I actually think there is a form of, we have to die to the God of certainty and satisfaction. We have to die to the attempt to escape life. And we need to experience God in the depth of life. That we need to experience an embrace of brokenness and unknowing, and a sense that we have to love the world and embrace the world. And that Christianity is about breaking free from the idea of life after death so that we can embrace the idea of life before death.
You've already mentioned a couple of times God as mystery, and that seems like a really important theme for you and a really important theme for the emerging church in general. Why is that?
Yeah, and to be honest, in Christianity, mysticism has, thankfully, quite a respectable genealogy. Within conservative and liberal and Orthodox and Catholic circles, you've got the mystics. And, whether it's a guilty pleasure and people are reading them in secret, or sometimes, they're celebrated, the mystics are there. I mean, partly the emerging churches, any time that a movement grows, the first group, it's like that story of the priest with the cat. He goes in to pray in a temple and there's a cat that's running around, all the time. So the old guy ties his cat to a tree while he prays, and then the old guy dies. And so the disciples continue to tie the cat to the tree. But then after, a few years, the cat dies. So the disciples go to the market and they buy a new cat so they can tie that cat to the tree during prayer time. And then after 7 generations of cats, the tree falls down. And so they plant a new tree to tie the 7th cat to. And finally the scholars come in and they write learned treatises about the theological significance of tying cats to trees during prayers. And the thing I like about that story is it's kind of how I think movements develop. At first, we use ideas and practices because they work. And then the next generation often hold on to them very tightly. And then the next generation lose the spirit. And then there has to be a generation that comes up and says, hold on a second, we've got to burst this open. And mysticism is like that bursting open. It's like that thing that has to come along every now and again and shake things up. I like to think of it as the heat that makes rocks molten, that makes things fluid. Because theology has never been reified. We often think that theology has been some rock solid, one idea that's existed over time. But the great thing is, you look at history and you realize that theology is this crazy, dynamic, ever-changing conversation that we're invited into. A conversation that's been there long before we were born and will be there long after we're dead. And so mysticism for me opens things up. Now, I will say that I am also critical of mysticism. And so I'm kind of on the left wing of the emerging church. And I think mysticism itself is problematic. But that's a question for another time.
Do you think this sort of rediscovery of mystery in the emerging church is a reactionary thing, though, perhaps to a sort of a conservative church that's tried to too tightly define God, or, a charismatic movement that can be quite casual about God? Is it a reactionary thing, do you think?
Yeah, I think it is to a certain extent. Although for me, in a sense, everything is reactionary. In the sense of everything is reacting to something else. Now that doesn't mean it's always negative or positive, but it's like the theology doesn't come from abstraction. I mean, I remember, I think it was Karl Barth, who would often, with his students, on his blackboard, he would write down kind of historical movements, the historical things that are happening in politics on one side of the blackboard, and then on the other he would list at the same time the theological movements that were happening at that time, and he would invite the students to explore the connections between what was happening politically and in the world and what was happening theologically. And so in a way, that's why I don't think anyone can say, we finally got it. Like on this interview, I'm going to say, Pete Rollins on the 14th of May in Belfast finally got the right theology, No, for me, the things that I'm doing are responses and reactions to things that have happened before. And what I want is I want people to respond and react to what I say. And for me, the truth is actually that, what's called dialectics, that movement of ongoing conversation that's transformative. And for me, it's like going into a museum and looking at a piece of art. Often we want to go, what does the piece of art mean? I want to find a singular meaning of the piece of art. But art has so much meaning. That's why you have to go back and see the same piece of art again and again and again. And in the same way, I think often the church looks at, say, the Bible or theology and says, what's the right answer? When really perhaps we should look at it more like a work of art and say, it's about engaging with a conversation with the work of art, seeing its beauty, being open to being transformed by it, being open to being ruptured by it, like you're being smashed against rocks. And so, in a sense, you always return back to the conversation because it will always speak in new and dynamic ways.
You mentioned earlier about this idea of God being an idol. I mean, your book's The Idolatry of God, isn't it? Can you just unpack that a little bit more, that idea?
Yeah, I mean, I want to kind of have quite a provocative title in the sense of something, The Idolatry of God, for a Christian book, to really marketed to Christians. I wanted something that would make us think for a moment. And what I'm really trying to say with that book is that, in a sense, we have made God into an idol. And Bonhoeffer is quite important to me in this, where he kind of, in his letters and papers from prison, said, we've made God into what he called the Deus Ex Machina, which is basically an object that we wheel into life when we've got a problem, or when we don't understand something, or when we're scared, or when we're suffering. And the God doesn't really change our material existence. It's just an idea that helps us sleep at night and kind of gives us an answer to questions. And he says, well, that God is impotent to someone who's not afraid of death and who is not afraid of questions. And he said that God also gets smaller and smaller the more answers we have, And he ultimately, and this is the way I read it, is kind of saying that this God of certainty and satisfaction is just an idol. It's not the real God. In fact, it's the same God that we see promised to us in every advertisement, in every magazine. If you consume this product, you'll be happy and complete. If you drive this car, you look this way, you marry this person, things will work out. And the church has come along, like the world's a huge vending machine, and they just put their product in beside all of the other products, saying, no, our product will make you whole and complete. And the argument of the book is, that God is impotent, because it doesn't work. If you don't get God, you don't fall over, you don't have the mystical experience. You hate life, you're always waiting for God to arrive. But if you do experience, this mystical experience, well, you still have to make sandwiches the next day. You still have to get on with life, and you can often become addicted to worship services, conferences, the latest book, the latest speaker. And in this book, I'm arguing that no, God is not the object that we approach. Like, the sacred is not some object that you can put alongside the secular. So there's the sacred realm and there's the secular realm. The sacred is the depth dimension that exists in all things. And God is found in the depth dimension of all of life, not in the running from life.
would certainly agree that there is that kind of individualistic consumer kind of influence in the church that we use God in the way that you're describing. But, I mean, isn't there also, there's a clear sense in the gospel that Jesus did meet people in their need and bring a sense of peace or a sense of healing, or we could look, for example, at Peter. You know, Peter was effectively saying, God's a mystery to us, who is he? And Jesus said, well, look at me. You're looking at the Father. There was a sense of revelation there as well. Yeah. So do you accept that there is a sense in which God reveals himself and can actually meet our needs?
Well, yeah, I mean, in relation to Jesus, it's fascinating because he does have a very interesting approach. He seems to, comforts the distressed and distresses the comfortable. But strangely, very rarely seems to give any good answers to people's questions. Often answers questions with other questions and, says things like, in order to find your life, you've got to lose it. And by the way, that's dialectics. What I love about that is, it's like if you're trying to find your life, if you're trying to gain certainty and satisfaction, if you want something good, you'll end up missing it. But actually, if you lose your life, then you strangely, you find you end up getting it. And we know this in life, if you're pursuing pleasure, then you end up, being that dutiful hedonist, going out to all the parties and having, not a good time at all. But if you kind of give that up and try to give yourself in service to others, you kind of find that there is a deep pleasure to that. Strangely, in the act of giving it up, you discover it. And so for me, there is a peace, but it's the peace of, and strangely, giving up the pursuit of peace. It sounds paradoxical at first, but it's kind of like grace. It's kind of like forgiveness. It's in the giving up of something that you discover it. It's in the letting go of the pursuit that you actually find what you're looking for.
In your book as well, you seem to focus on Jesus' cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then from this you make the point that the feeling of loss and separation are at the heart of the Christian faith and need to be explored. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, this is key to my work, and again, that makes it a huge question, and one that I'm just addressing in my next book, actually. I'm just finishing. If I could say it like this, for me, it's like Christianity is a magic trick. A magic trick, a vanishing trick, has three parts. It has, in Christopher Nolan's The Prestige, they describe it in three ways. The trick has the pledge, there's the bird, and then the bird disappears, and then there's the prestige, it's the return of the bird. But of course, the magic trick is you don't get the same bird back. It's another bird, that bird's dead, right? I know this with magic tricks, I've kind of been learning a few recently, and generally, if I make a coin disappear and make it return, you're not getting the same coin back. And the argument that I'm making is that in the book of Genesis, a trick is set up. You have an object that we want, which is a tree, this sacred fruit. You have a curtain, a prohibition, something that kind of gets in the way of it. And then, you have Adam and Eve who kind of want to get it. And the trick goes wrong. The reason why I call it a trick is because you see the same thing set up then in the crucifixion. In the temple, you have the Holy of Holies. That's the object that you want, the object where all the wholeness and completeness. You have a literal curtain that separates us, and then you have the court of Gentiles where people make their sacrifices. And my argument is the crucifixion, at the point that Christ cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's the experience of the death of the idol. And what I mean by that is, you see the turn. The curtain is ripped in half, just like a magician who rips the curtain back, and you discover the Holy of Holies is not there. God has disappeared. Christ is a magician. It's disappeared. This, for me, is the central meaning of the crucifixion, that God is gone. But then there's the prestige, and the prestige is the return of God. But God returns differently. Now God is returned where 2 or 3 are gathered together in love, where the thirsty are given water, the hungry are fed, the naked are clothed. Now God is not found as some object apart from the world, but we find or we touch the heart of God when we experience the depth that is in the world. And so, my God, why have you forsaken me? Is the central moment for me. It's the moment of the ripping of the curtain, the loss of God as the idol that we're pursuing, because then we'll be happy. And then the resurrection is the prestige, where we realize that God is the ground of our being, that as we let go of God as the object to grasp, we find God in the very depth of life itself.
Can you expand a bit more on the resurrection then? Because your book focuses quite a lot on the cry of dereliction, doesn't it? And from that drawing this sense that separation is at the heart of Christianity. But isn't the resurrection a joining back together again with God? That on the cross, Jesus was kind of temporarily separated, and then there's a reconnection. Yeah.
Well, I mean, what I'm doing in Idolatry of God in my next book is, and funny enough, is I don't do theology, I do Christology, and I'm kind of doing an atonement theory. And so what I'm arguing is slightly different from what we hear about atonement in the church. And by the way, as an aside, this is just an interesting aside, while the church made statements about kind of the orthodoxy of various positions at the Council of Nicaea and stuff like that, they never actually officially gave an atonement theory that is the orthodox one in the church. Now, there might be very pragmatic reasons for that. For example, just everybody agreed on one at that time, so they didn't need to make a statement because, there was one that was just taken to be right. But regardless, it's interesting, and that's why we have a number of atonement theories. We've got 3 or 4 that are very, very big. But the atonement theory that I'm working with is the idea that the idea is that Christ doesn't experience the separation in his being until the cross, and he experiences the separation. But my book argues, and I can't make the point really in a quick interview, but my book makes the point that we feel we're separated from something. We feel we're separated from God. But actually that separation is a lie. We're separated from something like, I think that if only I could get $10 million, I'd be happy. Or I think if only I had married that person, I'd be happy. We feel separated from something that we think will make us whole. And my argument is, it's actually a lie. There's nothing that we're separated from that can make us whole. And what Christianity does is it shows us that the separation is nothing. And if I can say it like this, it's like the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee was not the payment of a debt. It wasn't that I owed you $10,000 and someone else paid it for you. The year of Jubilee was the point when the debts, and by the way, debt is the nothing rendered something. So debt is nothingness rendered into material form. So it was the rendering of debt into nothingness. It was the exposure of nothing as nothing. That's what the year of Jubilee was at its most basic. And for me, the forgiveness of sin in Christianity is not the payment of debt, as in now you can be reconciled with something you're separated from, but rather is the separation is rendered nothing, and you realize you're not separated from anything. And it's actually the sense of separation that's the problem, and that God is there in the midst always. So that's, in brief, how I read what's going on in the crucifixion.
So we all feel that sense of separation, don't we, to varying degrees in our lives. Are you saying that that's an illusion, that that's not real?
Yeah, basically, I'm using, in the book, I argue that there's a fundamental experience when you're born. It happens at around the age of 6 to 18 months. It's called the mirror phase, and it's the point when you experience yourself as a subject, as a self. My name is Peter Rollins, I'm a self. And what happens at that point is, as soon as you experience yourself as a self, you experience somewhat yourself. As soon as I have an inner world, there's an outer world. As soon as there's an inside, there's an outside. So one of the most fundamental experiences of subjectivity is a sense of separation from something, right? Now, by the way, I argue for original sin and sin, but I don't take these as moral terms or mystical terms. I describe them as original sin simply means as an original meaning first and sin meaning separation, that we have an original sense of separation. Separation is combined with a prohibition. You see this in childhood. If I say to a kid, don't open that door when I leave the room, the child then wants to open the door. If I say, don't open that cookie jar, of course the kid's like, what's in the cookie jar? Paul called that the law. The law is the very thing that seems to prevent sin, but it actually creates sin. That idea generates the libidinal desire to sin. So my argument is that this original sense of separation, combined with a prohibition you can't have, generates our desire and our belief that there's something that can make us happy. So whenever you say to your kid, kid says, I want a puppy for Christmas, and you say you can't have a puppy, suddenly the puppy becomes more than just a puppy. The puppy's like, oh my goodness, no, I need the puppy, I want the puppy, you never have to buy me another present again, etc., etc. The puppy becomes more than just a little dog to play with. So my argument is that at the very constitutive experience of subjectivity is the sense of separation. Combine that with the law and you create the idol, the thing that you think will make you happy. And that Christianity is therefore the experience of seeing that we're not separated from something that will make us whole and complete, and then the embrace of the world.
How would you kind of sum up the whole area of hope then? Where should our hope come from within all this?
Yeah, hope, that's a great question. I mean, for me, hope is a very material thing. You know, like, it was Joe Hill, he critiqued the Salvation Army because they had this song about the sweet by and by that they would sing to the workers as they came back from the mines. And so he wrote this song, where we get the term pie in the sky when you die from. And basically what he was saying was, you know, sometimes the hope in something in the next life can rob us of hope for something in this life. For me, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have hope in something in the next life, but my main interest is how do we have hope for real change now in our lives. You know, for someone who's homeless now, for someone who is in a terrible job, for someone who's in a destructive relationship, how can we say there's hope? And for me, sadly, the first thing you have to do, have to bring a certain form of hopelessness. So Karl Marx, in his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, he said, religion is the opiate of the people, the heart of a heartless nation. But he said, it's the imaginary flowers and the chains of our oppression. We must take away the imaginary flowers so that we see the chains, not so that we despair, but so that we can take those chains and break them and therefore pick living flowers. And that for me is actually what true faith is about. It's about taking away the imaginary flowers. Hope is this, you know, whatever. Seeing our current oppression and giving people hope that they can break free of that and pick living flowers. So that's the kind of hope that I think is Christian hope.
Can you tell us a little bit about what this journey might look like in community, perhaps referring to some of your experiences in Ikon?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult because I used to be an evangelist, actually. I used to get people to believe, and I found that very easy. Because, you know, often we want to believe, you know, we want to feel that life is meaningful and purposeful and stuff like that. But to get people to doubt, to get people to question their cultural, political, religious ideas is very difficult. Because, I mean, I find it difficult. I don't want to do it. It's not that other people don't want to do it. I don't want to do it because it's a threat. Whenever I meet someone who's different from me, I either want to consume them, you know, make them think like me, bring them into my social body, or I want to vomit them out. If I can't do that, I want to get rid of them. Or I want to tolerate them. As long as you keep your beliefs and practice behind closed doors, then we can hang out. Or even interfaith dialogue where we say, well, beneath our differences, we're all pretty much the same. Now, I want to reject all four of those. Because in all four of them, I'm right. In the first three, I'm right and you're wrong. And in the fourth, we're both right. Let's have tea and biscuits, right? What I'm interested in is the true multicultural experience for me is when you meet the other and they're strange and monstrous, their beliefs and practices. But then you look at yourself through their eyes and you realize that you're strange and monstrous, that your views on marriage or life or whatever it is are actually bizarre. And so what I've done is develop collectives where we try to go through this experience of decentering, of fracturing ourselves, of opening ourselves up. Just one example, we have a group called the Evangelism Project where we go out to be evangelized by other people. Now, the idea is not that we'll be evangelized into Islam or Scientology or Judaism or whatever it is. The evangelism happens when we ask this other group that we visit, what do we look like to you? And then we see ourselves through their eyes. And we see things about ourselves that we haven't seen before. Because we're all like factories that create products, but also create pollution. While we don't intend to create the pollution, we do. And that's called an externality. And what you need to do is you need other people to come and say, look, you're creating this pollution. And then you become cognizant of it. And you begin to change your practices. So you become evangelized more into your own tradition. So, I mean, we've got a number of practices, but that's one of them.
And how would you see kind of the whole area of mission and discipleship then? within all this?
Yeah, I mean, this is the funny thing. There's always arguments that have happened in Christianity recently in a popular level, especially around a guy called Rob Bell. People saying, is he a universalist or is he not? Now, the funny thing for me as a philosopher is it's actually Christianity's always been a universal religion. It's always been. So within conservatism, Christianity is a universal religion because it has a message for everybody, right? It's not a particular religion like Judaism or Islam. It means the message is for everybody, and then you can accept it or reject it. But it has, and ironically, the other side to that is if you don't accept it, then you don't have a place. You have a place in the nowhere. You're the trash of the earth, because hell was literally the trash, the place of outside. So there's that, and then there's the liberal reading, which is the operative power of Christianity is for everybody. So it's like the message is for everybody, and also it works for everybody. So eventually you'll get to heaven anyway, and it'll all be great. Now, I kind of reject those two forms of universalism, but I think Paul has a much more interesting universalist, which is we are the trash of the world. That if we identify with Christ, we identify with one who lost all identity. On the cross, you lose all identity, political, cultural, religious identity, which is literally what the cross meant at the time, by the way. You were cursed of God. You were no longer a citizen. You were the complete outsider. So for Paul, when you identify with Christ, so there is no Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female anymore. There's no atheist or theist or no Christian or non-Christian or anything like that. To identify with Christ is to identify with the loss of all tribal identities. And therefore, interestingly, create a new community, like AA is an example of this, a community that transcends tribal identities. Or pirates, they also transcended tribal identities, because they were called the villains of all nations, which is similar to Paul's trash of the world. And because they were villains of all nations, they could welcome everybody to be part of it. The only people who didn't want to be part of it were the power structures, So what I'm arguing is that that's a message for all of us. That all of us need a universal message that we have to invite people into. That we are the trash of the world. That our tribal identities don't define us. That we can unify in a new type of collective. A collective of neither nor. A collective where our tribal identities don't define us. And this, by the way, is, I think, why Christ, I've come to bring a sword, not to cut one family against another, but to cut families from within. Father against son, mother against daughter. Because this new type of collective is very strange. It means that you're at war with your own tribe, but you can find peace with people in different tribes. Say, you're Catholic and I'm Protestant. I get on better with you than I do with people within my own tribe, not because of what we believe, because we don't believe the same thing, but because of how we believe what we believe. Even though I believe most of what my tribe believes, the way they believe it is so solid. Because even though we don't agree at the level of what, we engage at the level of how we believe what we believe. So that's discipleship for me. That's the mission of the church. That's what we need to proclaim to all the earth.
Pete, that's brilliant. There's so much stuff in there for us to get our teeth into, and I'm sure this is going to lead on to many conversations. So we're really thankful for your time today.
Oh, listen, thank you. Thanks for doing the interview. And I just want to say, of course, I want you to agree with me, and I want the people listening to this podcast to agree with me. But you know what? More than that, I don't. I want to facilitate a conversation. I want to be critiqued. I want us to have a good conversation. So I just hope that some of what I said is sparks off good conversation.
Yeah, that's what I love about this stuff, actually. That it just inspires conversation. So thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So there you go, Pete Rollins. He had a lot to say, didn't he?
He did.
That's got to be one of the densest interviews we've done, isn't it? Like every question we've asked, he packed into a 2-minute response so much stuff. It's tough to get your head around.
It was really tough. And
smart guy.
Yeah, very smart guy.
Scholastic philosophy. I don't even know what that is.
There were lots of big words put in there, and real meaty stuff that you want to chew over. I really want to listen to that again and kind of hear it back and take my time over what was being said.
Nomad Podcast is so good, we actually listen to it and enjoy it ourselves.
We do, yeah.
I heard, I think it was Ed Stetzer who tried to define the emerging church, and he broke it down into 3 categories, which I thought, all beginning with R. So you'll like this.
I
Because
like
things
it.
that
Yeah, I
rhyme and
do,
start
yeah,
the same letters, don't you?
Yeah.
First was relevance. So it's all the emerging church is the church's response to sort of postmodern culture. So he said the first was relevance, which is churches where the structures of the church and the beliefs of the church are the same, but they address postmodern issues. So they kind of, what they preach and the worship is sensitive to postmodernism. Then there's the Reconstructionists, which I would say we are, where our beliefs are still orthodox, but we've restructured the church in order to be more sensitive to postmodern culture, and the issues we look at are sensitive to postmodern culture. And then the third area is revisionists, where people actually re-examine their theology, their beliefs in light of postmodern culture. And I think that's probably the category that Pete Rollins is in, isn't it? So we've kind of looked at, we've re-examined our message and we've re-examined our structure, but it's still orthodox evangelical belief.
Yeah.
Whereas he's kind of daring to challenge those beliefs, isn't he? And saying, what has postmodern culture got to say about what we believe and the way we believe it? So that's why I find it quite challenging, because I've not really gone down that route.
Yeah, that whole evangelism project that he talked about, where you go and talk to other faiths.
Being evangelised by other people rather than going out to evangelise
Yeah.
people. I mean, it's challenging stuff, isn't it?
It's interesting, isn't it, to actually go to do it on that sort of reversal where you actually are finding out about yourself, and that is really digging deep, then, isn't it, into what you believe and what other people are saying about you. Yeah, it's good.
I thought the whole idea about idolising God is a fascinating idea, isn't it? And about how we can just use God as another product in culture or in society to meet our needs. That's challenging, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and I can see what he's saying about that, because in a certain sense we do idolise God, don't we? And we kind of we do. There's this whole sort of safety structure of God, but is God totally safe? I don't know.
And it's the whole individualistic thing, isn't it? That it's about us and what God's doing for us and how God meets our needs. So he talked about, the sort of almost getting addicted to conferences, to worship CDs, to books, and God just becomes a product to sort of feed that need, that gap within us.
Yeah.
Where he was sort of saying the message of Jesus is actually you've got to give everything up.
Yeah.
And you've got to give up your life, and you've got to give up those needs and those wants, and that's kind of where you really find God. That's challenging, isn't it? Because we're so immersed in this culture, in this consumer culture, that often we don't even realise that that's what's happening. But I can see that it is.
Yeah, really dying to self, in every way.
Yeah, and even dying to that sense of need.
Yeah.
That's deep stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's really deep stuff.
Because if you are really dead, then you don't have any needs, do you? So it's kind of getting to that sort of level it is really hard.
Yeah.
Because we all have needs, don't we?
So I'd say, love him or hate him, you've got to admire what he's doing, and it stirs up conversation, doesn't it? I mean, I saw him at Greenbelt a couple of years ago, and we walked out of it, a small group of us, and we must have spent an hour or two afterwards just talking through all of it and just thinking. Came out a bit kind of confused and a bit dazed.
That's how I feel right now.
But once we started drilling down to it, and even those people that are just saying, look, that's just not where I'm at, I'm not into that, that's not where I'm at, that's not my understanding. Still, you can dig into it and think, actually, that is saying something to, like the whole idolatry of God.
Yeah.
There is something there that I need to think about.
I mean, each of his points you almost wanted to kind of dig deeper with, because the whole thing of... And I love that film, The Prestige, that he was talking about, and the 3 points of the Prestige, and the death and the resurrection. I thought it was a completely, and again, another new take on the resurrection and the curtain splitting in two. And suddenly here is a new God, and a new way of looking at God. And I think I agreed with what he said through that. Suddenly that God is with us, that He's there with us. But and I guess we do believe that, but it's just opening up a new perspective on that God being with us in a new way.
There's a lot there, isn't there?
There is a lot there.
I think with an interview like this, though, you're literally just saying, just open up this topic, quickly open up this topic. You can't drill into it.
No, you can't, no.
So hopefully there's enough there that everyone will find something that will get them thinking.
I think there's going to be a lot of conversation out there. I think we're going to continue having a conversation after this as well. So
yeah,
But that's good, isn't it? Conversation's good.
Yeah. So thanks, Pete Rollins.
Indeed. Lots to think about, again.
Yeah. If you can be bothered, say something on Facebook.
Yeah, let's get a discussion going on there. That would be good.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to see how people respond to this and what they make of it.
So until next time.
For more about Nomad, check out nomadblog.co.uk.